Sometimes life builds our entire existence on a foundation of lies, and when those lies crumble, we discover that the truth was more beautiful and terrifying than we ever imagined. In that old Victorian house, I was about to uncover secrets that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family. Hello, my dear ones. This is Rosa. I'm 75 years old today with a heart full of stories that need to be told. Before I begin this story that completely changed my understanding of who I am, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me such joy to know my stories reach so many different places. Today I'm going to tell you how I discovered that my entire life was built on the most loving lie ever told, and how that discovery led me to understand the incredible courage of the women who came before me. This story begins in São Borja, Rio Grande do Sul, a small city on the Argentine border where German traditions run deep and family secrets run even deeper. It was the spring of 2019 when I inherited my mother's house, and with it, a mystery that would consume the next 18 months of my life. My mother, Elizabeth Muller, had passed away peacefully at 93, taking with her what I thought were just normal family stories. But as I stood in that dusty attic, holding a sealed wooden box I'd never seen before, I realized that some stories are too dangerous to tell while the storyteller is still alive. The house itself seemed to whisper secrets that afternoon. Every creaking floorboard, every shadow cast by the late autumn sun through the windows seemed to be trying to tell me something I'd been too young or too trusting to understand during all those years of childhood. The box was heavy, older than anything else in the house, with German words carved into its lid that I couldn't read, despite the German lessons my mother had insisted upon during my youth. My hands trembled as I lifted the latch, not knowing that this single moment would divide my life into before and after. The hinges protested with a sound like a sigh, as if the box itself had been holding its breath for decades. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, were letters written in a beautiful German script, photographs of a woman who looked exactly like my mother, but wearing jewelry I'd never seen her own, and most puzzling of all, a birth certificate with a name I didn't recognize. The woman in the photographs had my mother's face, but her eyes held secrets that my mother's never had. There was something about her smile, something wild and free that I'd never seen in my quiet, reserved mother. She was posed in places I didn't recognize, wearing clothes that were far more fashionable and daring than anything I'd ever seen Elizabeth wear. In one photograph, she was dancing with a man whose face had been carefully scratched out with black ink. In another, she was holding a baby, and there was such fierce joy in her expression that it took my breath away. As I held those mysterious documents, the late afternoon sun streaming through the attic window seemed to whisper that everything I thought I knew about my family was about to change forever. The first person I thought to ask about these strange discoveries was Mrs. Zimmerman, our 90-year-old neighbor who had lived next door since before I was born. Ingrid Zimmerman was one of those women who seemed to have been elderly for as long as anyone could remember, with sharp blue eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that were always busy with knitting or gardening or some other practical task. She was the only person still alive who had known my mother as a young woman, but every time the past came up in conversation, Mrs. Zimmerman would get this odd look in her eyes and quickly change the subject. I'd always attributed it to the natural reluctance of elderly people to dwell on old sorrows, but now I wondered if there was something more deliberate about her evasiveness. The walk to her house had never seemed so long, even though it was just across our small front yard and through the gate that separated our properties. Her house was a mirror image of ours, built by the same German immigrant who had constructed most of the homes on our street in the 1940s. The familiar scent of her rose garden and the sound of her ancient wind chimes did nothing to calm my racing heart. I knocked on her door that evening, the mysterious photographs tucked carefully in my purse. my heart pounding with anticipation and dread. Mrs. Zimmerman invited me in for coffee, as she had countless times over the years, but this time felt different. Her usually spotless kitchen seemed somehow smaller, more cramped, as if the secrets I was about to reveal were taking up physical space. When I showed her the photographs, her coffee cup rattled against its saucer, and she was quiet for so long, I thought she might have fallen asleep. The silence stretched between us like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. Finally, she set down her cup with deliberate care and looked directly into my eyes for what felt like the first time in decades. "Rosa," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "your mother made me promise never to speak of this, but I suppose promises to the dead have their own expiration date." What she told me next shattered the foundation of everything I believed about my family. My mother, she revealed, had not been an only child, as she'd always claimed. She had an identical twin sister named Anna, and the two had been inseparable until something happened in 1952 that split them apart forever. "They were so alike," Mrs. Zimmerman said, her weathered hands holding the photographs with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, that sometimes even I couldn't tell them apart. "Your mother was Elizabeth, the gentle one, always following rules and meeting expectations. She was the one who helped her mother with the cooking and cleaning, who never missed church, who never questioned why things were the way they were. Anna was the wild one, the dreamer who questioned everything and never backed down from a fight. She read books about politics and women's rights, things that made their father very nervous. She had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to share them, even when sharing them got her into trouble." The realization hit me like a physical blow that left me gasping for air. If my mother had a twin sister, what had happened to her? And why had this fundamental fact about our family been hidden from me for 75 years? Mrs. Zimmerman's eyes filled with tears as she continued. "After what happened, they made a decision that changed both their lives forever. Anna disappeared one night, and Elizabeth became someone else entirely. I left Mrs. Zimmerman's house that night with more questions than answers, but with one certainty that terrified me. The woman who had raised me, who had tucked me into bed and taught me to bake German Christmas cookies, had been keeping a secret so profound that it had shaped every day of my childhood. The walk back to my house felt like crossing a bridge between two different worlds. On one side was the comfortable, predictable life I'd always known, where Elizabeth Muller was my devoted mother, and our family history was simple and straightforward. On the other side was a realm of uncertainty, where nothing was as it seemed, and everyone I'd trusted had been part of an elaborate deception. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in the bed where I'd slept as a child, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the woman Mrs. Zimmerman had described with the quiet, conventional mother I remembered. Had there been signs I'd missed? Moments when Elizabeth's mask had slipped and revealed glimpses of the sister she was impersonating. The next morning, I drove to the Gillespie County Courthouse in São Borja, determined to find official records that might shed light on my family's mysterious past. I'd always been curious by nature, a trait that had sometimes gotten me into trouble as a child, when I'd asked too many questions about family photographs, or wondered aloud why we never visited any relatives. Now that curiosity felt like the only tool I had to uncover the truth. The courthouse was a beautiful limestone building that had stood in São Borja's main square since 1920. Its German-influenced architecture a testament to the immigrant community that had built this part of Rio Grande do Sul. Its records department was run by a kind woman named Margaret, who had known my mother for decades and remembered me as the little girl who used to accompany Elizabeth to register births and deaths in our extended community. When I explained what I was looking for, Margaret's expression grew troubled in a way that reminded me of Mrs. Zimmerman's reaction. "Oh, querida," she said. leading me to a back room filled with filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic dust. I was wondering when someone from your family would finally come asking about this. There was a fire here in 1967, supposedly accidental, but it destroyed a very specific set of records from the 1950s. Some folks always wondered if that fire was a little too convenient, if you know what I mean. She pulled out a drawer and showed me gaps where files should have been, like missing teeth in a smile. The empty spaces seemed to mock my search for truth, as if someone had deliberately erased the evidence I needed most. But Margaret had something else to show me, something that made my blood run cold, and my hands shake with the implications. "Before you go," she said, reaching into her desk drawer with the careful movements of someone handling something precious and dangerous. "You should know that your birth certificate was reissued in 1953. The original was supposedly damaged, but I've always found it odd that a 1-year-old's birth certificate would need replacing." She handed me a manila folder containing my replacement birth certificate, and as I stared at it with new eyes, I noticed details that had never seemed important before, but now felt like clues to a puzzle I was just beginning to understand. The paper was different from birth certificates issued around the same time, slightly yellowed in a way that suggested it had been stored somewhere damp before being filed. The handwriting, though official, seemed rushed, as if whoever had filled it out had been nervous or working under pressure. More disturbing still, there were tiny pinholes in the corners, as if it had been attached to other documents and then removed. Most shocking of all, when I held it up to the light, I could see the faint impression of words that had been erased, ghostly letters that spelled out a different story than the one officially recorded. "Margaret?" I asked, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it steady. "What was my name before this certificate was issued?" She looked around to make sure we were alone, then leaned closer and whispered, "According to the records I've seen, your name was originally Anna Rosa Muller. But Querida, that's all I know for sure. The rest of those records went up in smoke 52 years ago, and whoever ordered that fire made sure they'd never tell their secrets." The drive home that day was a blur of confusion and growing horror. Not only had my mother hidden the existence of a twin sister, but my very identity had been altered when I was just a baby. Every landmark I passed on the familiar road seemed different now, as if I was seeing my hometown through the eyes of a stranger. The German bakery where Elizabeth had bought my birthday cakes, the church where I'd been confirmed, the school where I'd learned to read and write. All of it felt like props in an elaborate stage production where I'd been the only person who didn't know I was acting in a play. As I sat in my car outside the house that had been my childhood home, I wondered how many other lies my life had been built upon, and whether I had the courage to keep digging for answers that might destroy everything I thought I knew about myself. The house itself seemed different now, its familiar blue shutters and white picket fence looking like a disguise rather than the warm, welcoming home I remembered. Every window seemed to be watching me, every shadow hiding another secret I'd been too innocent or too trusting to recognize. The garden where Elizabeth had taught me to tend tomatoes and roses suddenly looked like a carefully constructed facade, beautiful on the surface but hiding God knows what underneath. I sat there until the sun began to set, trying to summon the courage to go inside and continue searching for truths that I was beginning to suspect would hurt far more than the comfortable lies I'd lived with for 75 years. But my determination, that stubborn streak that Elizabeth had always said would either be my greatest asset or my biggest weakness, finally won out over my fear. There were more secrets hidden in that house, and I was going to find every single one of them, no matter what the cost. That weekend, I decided to visit my great-aunt Frida's old house on the outskirts of town, a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. Aunt Frida had died 5 years earlier, leaving her property to the Lutheran Church. But Pastor Heinrich had given me permission to look through any remaining personal items before they cleared out the house for renovation. The drive to Frida's house took me through countryside that had been largely unchanged since my childhood, past fields of soybeans and cattle pastures that stretched to the horizon under the endless Rio Grande do Sul sky. I'd never been particularly close to Aunt Frida, who had always seemed distant and sad, carrying herself like a woman who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had decided that solitude was the safest response. She had never married, never had children, and had spent her final decades living alone in the house that had been built by her father when the family first immigrated from Germany in the 1930s. Now I wondered if her sadness had been connected to whatever secrets my family had been keeping, if she too had been burdened with knowledge that was too dangerous to share. The house was smaller than I remembered, with that particular smell of old wood and faded roses that seems to permeate homes where elderly people have lived alone for too long. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. In what had been Frida's bedroom, a austere space with a single bed and a crucifix on the wall, I found a cedar chest that no one had bothered to move, probably because it was too heavy and seemed too personal to dispose of carelessly. The chest was beautiful, hand-carved with German designs that spoke of the old country and traditions that had been carefully preserved across an ocean and several generations. Inside that chest, wrapped in layers of delicate tissue paper that smelled of lavender and old memories, I discovered a collection of diaries written in my great-aunt's careful handwriting. Dating back to the early 1950s, the diaries were bound in leather covers that had been lovingly maintained despite their age. And Frida's handwriting was the careful script of someone who had been educated in the old German traditions where penmanship was considered a mark of character. As I read her entries by the fading afternoon light, a picture began to emerge of two young women facing an impossible choice that would define the rest of their lives. According to Frida's diary, Anna had fallen in love with a man her father had forbidden her to see, not because he was unsuitable in terms of class or background, but because he was involved in what Frida cryptically referred to as political activities that could bring shame on our family. The entries from 1952 became increasingly desperate as Anna's romance intensified and her father's disapproval grew more violent and threatening. The diary entries painted a picture of a household in crisis where love and politics had collided in ways that threatened to destroy everything the Muller family had worked to build in their new country. Anna grows more defiant each day, Frida had written in careful German script. Father forbids her to see Wilhelm, but she sneaks out to meet him anyway. Mother weeps constantly, torn between supporting her daughter's happiness and fearing for our family's reputation in the community. Elizabeth tries to mediate, but Anna's passion makes her deaf to reason. I fear this will end badly for everyone. The entries revealed that Wilhelm Schmidt was not just any young man, but someone whose political activities had attracted the attention of the federal police during the Vargas era, when German immigrants were viewed with suspicion and their loyalty to Brazil was constantly questioned. The Mueller family had worked hard to establish themselves as respectable citizens, contributing to their community and staying out of politics. Anna's involvement with Wilhelm threatened to undo decades of careful reputation building. Then, in September of 1952, came the entry that changed everything. Anna is with child, and father threatens to disown her completely. He says that if she insists on ruining herself with that political agitator, she can face the consequences alone. But Elizabeth has made the most selfless offer I've ever witnessed. She says she will take Anna's place in the marriage father has arranged with Heinrich Brenner, and Anna will take Elizabeth's identity and disappear until the scandal passes. They believe no one will be able to tell them apart, and perhaps they're right. But I fear this deception will destroy them both. Reading those words, I felt as if the ground had shifted beneath my feet. Elizabeth had voluntarily entered into an arranged marriage to save her sister's reputation. The sacrifice was even greater than I'd initially understood. She hadn't just taken on Anna's identity. She had taken on Anna's consequences, while giving Anna her own chance at freedom. The diary revealed that Heinrich Brenner was a good man, kind and prosperous. But he was also a man who expected his wife to be conventional, obedient, and content with domestic life. For the adventurous Anna, such a marriage would have been a prison. For the gentle Elizabeth, it might have been exactly what she wanted. But the switch meant that Elizabeth would have to pretend to be someone she wasn't for the rest of her life, while Anna would have to disappear completely from the world that had shaped her. The diary's final entry about the twins was heartbreaking. The switch happened last night. Anna, now calling herself Elizabeth, left town with Heinrich Brenner, the man father chose for Elizabeth. My real Elizabeth, now using Anna's name, has gone to live with our cousin in Austin until her condition becomes obvious. I pray God will forgive us all for this deception, but I understand why they felt they had no choice. Society gives women so few options when they fall in love with the wrong man. I sat on the floor of that dusty bedroom, surrounded by my great-aunt's memories, and realized that the woman I'd called Mother my entire life had actually been my Aunt Elizabeth, who had sacrificed her own chance at happiness to save her pregnant sister's reputation. The revelation that my real mother had been the wild, passionate Anna sent me on a desperate search for any trace of what had happened to her after she disappeared from São Borja. Frida's diaries mentioned a cousin in Porto Alegre, so I spent the next several weeks making phone calls and searching online records, following a trail that seemed to grow colder with each passing day. My determination had always been one of my strongest traits, something my mother, or rather, Aunt Elizabeth had often said, would either be my greatest asset or my biggest weakness. She had encouraged this trait when I was solving puzzles or learning new skills, but had seemed worried when I applied it to family questions that she clearly preferred to leave unanswered. Now it felt like the only thing keeping me anchored as my understanding of reality continued to shift like sand beneath my feet. The search led me through a maze of bureaucratic records, immigration documents, and church registries that painted a picture of a family network that extended far beyond what I'd ever imagined. The German immigrant community in Rio Grande do Sul had been tight-knit by necessity, providing support and protection for each other during times when their loyalty to Brazil was questioned and their cultural practices were viewed with suspicion. Finally, through a combination of persistence and luck that felt almost divine, I found a reference to Ana Müller in the records of Igreja São Pedro in Porto Alegre, where she had apparently given birth to a child in March of 1953. The church secretary, a helpful woman named Patricia, agreed to look through their old baptismal records and found something that made my heart race with a mixture of excitement and terror. "It's unusual," Patricia explained over the phone. "But the records show that Anna Müller died in childbirth, and the baby was sent to live with Elizabeth Müller of São Borja. The father's name is listed as Wilhelm Schmidt, but there's a note that he was unavailable to care for the child due to political circumstances. Wilhelm Schmidt." I wrote the name down with trembling hands, realizing that somewhere out there, I might have a father I'd never known existed. But more than that, I now understood the full scope of the sacrifice Elizabeth had made. She hadn't just taken Anna's place in an arranged marriage, she had also taken in Anna's baby and raised that child as her own. Except I had no memory of a sibling, which meant something had happened to that child as well, or the terrible thought crept into my mind slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape I didn't want to see. What if I was that baby? What if everything I'd believed about my own birth and parentage was just another layer of the elaborate deception that had shaped my entire life. The implications were staggering. If Anna had been my biological mother, then Elizabeth had raised me not just as her niece, but as her sister's child, loving me with the fierce devotion of someone who had made an impossible promise to a dying woman. That evening, I called Mrs. Zimmerman again, armed with names and dates that I hoped might unlock more of her memories. When I mentioned Wilhelm Schmidt, there was such a long silence on the phone that I thought we'd been disconnected. I could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, as if she was weighing each word before speaking. The silence stretched so long that I began to wonder if the weight of decades-old secrets was finally too much for her to bear. "Rosa," she finally said, her voice heavy with old sorrow, and something that sounded like relief. "Wilhelm was your real father, and he was indeed involved in dangerous political activities. He was organizing resistance to some of the government's policies that were unfairly targeting German immigrants during the Vargas years. Work that could have gotten him imprisoned or worse. Work that made loving him a dangerous proposition for any woman brave enough to try." She paused, and I could hear the sound of her settling deeper into her chair, as if the story she was about to tell required her to be physically grounded. "When Anna died and left that baby, Elizabeth was terrified that Wilhelm would come looking for his child and bring unwanted attention to our community. The federal police were already suspicious of German families, looking for any excuse to investigate our backgrounds and question our loyalty. Having a known political agitator connected to our family would have put everyone at risk. The truth hit me like a thunderbolt that illuminated everything while simultaneously destroying the landscape I thought I knew. "Rosa, querida," Mrs. Zimmerman continued gently, "you were that baby. Anna wasn't just your aunt. She was your birth mother, and Elizabeth raised you as her own daughter to protect you from a father whose political activities made him dangerous to know. Elizabeth never legally adopted you because that would have required paperwork that might have attracted attention, but she loved you as fiercely as any mother could love a child." I sank into my kitchen chair, my legs suddenly too weak to support me. Everything made sense now. My restless nature, my tendency to question authority, my fierce sense of justice that had sometimes put me at odds with Elizabeth's more conventional approach to life. These weren't character traits I'd developed despite my upbringing. They were my inheritance from a mother I'd never known and a father who had risked everything for his principles. "But why didn't she ever tell me?" I whispered into the phone. "Why keep the secret even after all these years?" Mrs. Zimmerman's voice was infinitely gentle. "Because she was afraid, minha filha. Afraid that if you knew the truth, you'd want to find Wilhelm, and that finding him might put you in danger. Afraid that you'd feel she had stolen you from your real parents and stop loving her the way she needed to be loved. Elizabeth's whole life was built around protecting you, even when that protection required her to break her own heart every single day. Learning that Elizabeth had essentially stolen me from my biological father to protect me created a moral complexity I wasn't prepared for. On one hand, I felt betrayed by a lifetime of lies, angry that I'd been denied the chance to know my real parents and understand my true heritage. On the other hand, I began to understand that every lie had been told from a place of fierce love and protection, and that Elizabeth's sacrifice had been even greater than I'd initially realized. My loyalty to family had always been absolute, a trait that had sometimes made me too trusting. But now that loyalty was being tested in ways I'd never imagined. How do you remain loyal to someone who lied to you for 75 years, even when those lies were motivated by love? I needed to know what had happened to Wilhelm Schmidt, my real father, and whether Elizabeth's fears about him had been justified, or if her protectiveness had robbed us both of a relationship we might have treasured. The Fredericksburg Public Library had an excellent local history collection, and the librarian, a young man named David, who was working on his master's thesis about German-American communities in Texas, was eager to help me research. Together, we spent hours going through old newspapers, immigration records, and community newsletters from the 1950s. What we found painted a picture of a man who had been both heroic and dangerous, depending on your perspective and your tolerance for political dissent. Wilhelm Schmidt had indeed been involved in organizing resistance to government policies that were unfairly targeting German Americans during and after World War II. He had helped families whose assets had been frozen without due process, provided legal assistance to men who were being questioned by federal agents, and published underground newsletters criticizing what he saw as constitutional violations. His activities weren't treasonous, but they were certainly radical for the time, and they had made him a target for federal surveillance. In 1953, just months after Anna's death, Wilhelm had been arrested on charges of sedition and sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. "Based on what I'm seeing here," David said, pointing to a newspaper clipping from 1958. "Wilhelm was released early for good behavior, but he seems to have disappeared from public records after that. There's no death certificate, no marriage license, no property records. It's like he just vanished." The possibility that my biological father might still be alive, somewhere out there unaware of my existence, filled me with a mixture of excitement and terror. Elizabeth had robbed us both of the chance to know each other, but she had also potentially saved my life by keeping me away from a man whose activities had made him a target of federal law enforcement. As I sat in that library, surrounded by the documentary evidence of my family's hidden history, I realized that Elizabeth's deception had been both a betrayal and the greatest act of love anyone had ever shown me. The search for Wilhelm Schmidt became my obsession over the following months, consuming my thoughts and driving me to pursue every possible lead with the determination that had always been my defining characteristic. I hired a private investigator, a retired police detective named Roberto Chen, who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. Roberto warned me that after 66 years, the chances of finding Wilhelm alive were slim. But he agreed to take the case because he found the family story fascinating, and because he understood what it meant to spend a lifetime wondering about missing pieces of your identity. His own family had immigrated from China in the 1940s, and he knew how easily people could disappear into new identities when circumstances required it. While we waited for results from his investigation, I continued to explore the house that Elizabeth had left me, now seeing it with new eyes and understanding that every corner might hold another secret. Every piece of furniture might have been chosen to hide rather than reveal. The house felt different now, less like a home and more like a museum of carefully curated lies. Every family photograph on the mantel, every piece of furniture, every decorative object seemed to be part of an elaborate stage set designed to support Elizabeth's performance as my mother rather than my aunt. In the basement, behind a false wall that I discovered purely by accident when I knocked over a heavy bookshelf while searching for Christmas decorations, I found a small room that had clearly been used as a hiding place. The space was cramped, but carefully organized, with built-in shelves and a ventilation system that suggested it had been designed for long-term concealment rather than simple storage. Inside were stacks of newspapers from the 1950s, pamphlets in both German and Portuguese criticizing government overreach, and most importantly, a box of letters addressed to Elizabeth from someone signing himself only as W. The letters were love letters, passionate and desperate, written by a man who was clearly Wilhelm Schmidt, begging Elizabeth to let him see his child. Each letter was more heartbreaking than the last, documenting a father's growing desperation as his pleas were ignored, and his child grew up without knowing he existed. "My beloved Anna," one letter began, and I realized that Wilhelm never knew about the identity switch. He believed he was writing to Anna, not knowing that Anna had died and Elizabeth had taken her place. The letters painted a picture of a man who was heartbroken and confused by Elizabeth's refusal to see him or let him meet his son. He had no way of knowing that the woman he was writing to wasn't the woman he had fallen in love with, and that his child was being raised by someone who was terrified that any contact with him would bring danger to their door. "I don't understand why you've changed so completely," one particularly painful letter read. "The woman I fell in love with would never keep a father from his child, no matter how dangerous the world has become. You used to believe that fighting for justice was worth any risk, but now you seem content to hide behind conventional respectability while our child grows up without knowing where he comes from. Please just let me hold our baby once. Let me see for myself that he's healthy and happy, and then I'll disappear forever if that's what you truly want." The letters were filled with details about Wilhelm's life after Anna's death, his growing involvement in civil rights activities, his arrest and imprisonment, and his eventual release into a world that no longer made sense to him. He wrote about his time in prison, where he had met other political prisoners who had been separated from their families by circumstances beyond their control. He wrote about his dreams of returning to São Borja to build a life with Anna and their child, dreams that Elizabeth's silence was slowly destroying. "I've been released," read a letter dated 1958, "and the first thing I wanted to do was come home to you and our son. But when I arrived in São Borja, Mrs. Zimmerman told me you had moved away and left no forwarding address. She seemed nervous, frightened even, and I couldn't understand why. Have I done something to offend you? Have my political activities brought shame on you? I would give up everything, every cause I've ever believed in, if it meant I could be a father to our child." The letters stopped abruptly in 1959, and I found myself crying for a man I'd never met, a father who had died without ever knowing that his child had grown up safe and loved, just a few hours away from where he'd last seen the woman he thought was Anna. Elizabeth had carried the weight of this deception for 65 years, letting Wilhelm believe that the mother of his child had simply stopped loving him, rather than revealing that Anna was dead and their child was being raised under a false identity. The depth of her sacrifice was becoming clearer with each revelation, but so was the magnitude of the secret she had carried to her grave. In the very last letter, Wilhelm's handwriting was shaky with emotion, and perhaps poor health. "I'm growing old," he wrote, "and I fear I may never see our child. If something happens to me, I want you to know that despite everything, I never stopped loving you or hoping that someday you would forgive whatever I did to drive you away. Our child deserves to know that his father loved him, even from a distance, even when that love brought nothing but pain." As I read those final words, I understood that Elizabeth's secret had created victims on all sides. Wilhelm had spent his final years believing himself abandoned and forgotten, while I had grown up believing my father was a man named Heinrich Brenner, who had died when I was young. Roberto Chen called me on a Tuesday morning in early October with news that would change everything once again. "Rosa," he said, his voice carefully controlled in the way that suggested he was about to deliver information that would be difficult to process. "I found Wilhelm Schmidt, and he's still alive. He's 89 years old, living in a retirement community in Porto Alegre. But there's something else you need to know before you decide whether to contact him. He's been looking for you too." My hands started shaking so violently that I had to put down the coffee cup I'd been holding, and I sank into the nearest chair as Roberto continued his explanation. "He never gave up hope," Roberto continued, his voice gentle with understanding. "According to the people I spoke with at his retirement home, he still talks about the great love of his life and the child he never got to meet. Rosa, this man has spent the last 66 years believing that Anna simply abandoned him and kept their child away out of spite or fear. He has no idea that Anna died, or that you were raised by her sister, or that you've lived your entire life just 2 hours away from him. The moral weight of this revelation was staggering, threatening to crush me with its implications. For nearly 7 decades, Wilhelm had carried the pain of abandonment and rejection, while I had grown up believing my father was a man named Heinrich Brenner, who had died when I was young. Elizabeth's web of protective lies had created suffering for everyone involved. Yet I couldn't deny that her intentions had been pure. She had seen a pregnant teenager die in childbirth, and a dangerous man who might have brought federal investigators to their quiet community. And she had made the only decision that seemed to guarantee my safety. But now, with both Elizabeth and Anna dead, I had the power to heal wounds that had festered for nearly 70 years. The question was whether I had the right to disrupt Wilhelm's life with the truth, or whether some secrets were meant to stay buried with the people who created them. "There's more," Roberto continued. "Wilhelm has a considerable estate that he's been trying to will to his child and grandchildren, if they can ever be found. He's hired investigators before, but they were always looking for Anna Muller and a child who would be in his 60s by now. They never thought to look for a child who might have been raised under a different identity, by a different member of the family. I spent days walking through the streets of São Borja, past the same German bakeries and limestone buildings that had been there when my young mother fled to Porto Alegre to hide her pregnancy, trying to decide what Elizabeth would want me to do. The weight of the decision felt enormous, not just for me, but for Wilhelm, who was nearing the end of his life still carrying the pain of believing himself abandoned by the woman he loved. In the end, it was my curiosity and my determination that made the choice for me, the same traits that had driven me to search for the truth even when that search threatened to destroy everything I thought I knew about my life. Wilhelm Schmidt deserved to know that Anna had loved him until her dying breath, and that their child had grown up happy and safe, even if that knowledge came with the painful revelation that he had been lied to for nearly 70 years. I called Roberto and asked him to arrange a meeting, knowing that I was about to have the most important conversation of my life with a man who had no idea he was about to meet his daughter. The meeting with Wilhelm Schmidt took place on a sunny Thursday afternoon at his retirement community in Porto Alegre, a beautiful facility with gardens and walking paths that reminded me of the parks where Elizabeth used to take me as a child. I had spent hours deciding what to say, how to explain 66 years of complicated family history without causing him to have a heart attack from the shock. Roberto had suggested meeting in the community's quiet garden, away from other residents who might overhear our conversation. When I first saw Wilhelm sitting on a bench beneath an old jacaranda tree, I was struck by how much I looked like him. He had the same strong jaw I saw in the mirror every morning, the same way of tilting his head when he was thinking deeply, the same restless energy that seemed to vibrate beneath a surface of forced calm. His eyes, though clouded with age, still held the passionate intelligence that Elizabeth's letters had described, and when he looked at me, I saw a flicker of recognition that suggested some part of him knew who I was before I even spoke. "Mr. Schmidt," I said, sitting down beside him and trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Rosa, and I have some things to tell you about Anna Muller that I think you've been waiting a very long time to hear." Over the next 2 hours, I told him everything. I explained about the twin sisters, about Anna's death in childbirth, about Elizabeth's decision to take Anna's identity and raise me as her own daughter. I watched his face transform as he realized that the woman he'd thought had rejected him had actually died loving him, and that the child he'd spent decades trying to find had been living under a different name just a few hours away from him. When I finished my story, Wilhelm was quiet for a long time, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, his hands trembling, with the weight of decades of misunderstood pain finally being lifted from his shoulders. Finally, Wilhelm reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small worn leather journal that looked like it had been handled thousands of times over the years. "I've written to Anna every day for 66 years, he said, his voice breaking with emotion that had been building for decades. "Love letters, stories about my life, things I wanted to tell our child. I always hoped that someday I'd be able to give these letters to both of you." He handed me the journal, and I could see that it contained thousands of entries, a lifetime of words written to people he thought had forgotten him. The leather cover was soft with age and use, and when I opened it, I could see that every page was filled with his careful handwriting, documenting a life lived in the shadow of loss and hope. "Your mother?" he said, and I realized he was talking about Anna, not Elizabeth. She was the bravest person I ever knew. She wasn't afraid of anything, not even of loving someone who might bring danger into her life. When she stopped answering my letters, I thought she'd decided that safety was more important than love. I never imagined that she had died trying to bring our child into the world safely. That afternoon marked the beginning of a relationship that neither of us had ever expected to have. Wilhelm and I began meeting regularly, and I learned about the father I'd never known, a man whose political courage had indeed put our family at risk, but whose love for Anna and for me had never wavered, even through decades of separation and misunderstanding. He told me stories about Anna that brought her to life in ways that photographs never could. Stories about her fierce intelligence, her passionate commitment to justice, and her unwavering belief that love could overcome any obstacle. She used to say that people who are afraid to fight for what they believe in don't deserve the freedom they take for granted. Wilhelm told me during one of our walks through the retirement community's gardens. Anna believed that staying silent in the face of injustice was the same as collaborating. With it, she helped me organize meetings, distributed our newsletters, even stood up in town hall meetings to challenge policies she thought were unconstitutional. Through Wilhelm's memories, I began to understand that both sisters had been heroes in their own ways. Anna had been willing to risk everything for her principles, while Elizabeth had been willing to sacrifice everything for her family. The identity switch hadn't just been about hiding a pregnancy. It had been about Elizabeth stepping into a more conventional role, while Anna disappeared into a life where she could continue her dangerous political work without putting her family at risk. But then came the revelation that would change everything I thought I understood about my family's story. A truth so unexpected that it would force me to reevaluate everything I had learned about love, sacrifice, and the price of keeping secrets. Wilhelm pulled out a manila envelope that he'd been carrying with him to our meetings but had never opened, handling it with the reverence of someone approaching a sacred mystery. "Rosa," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets he had carried alone for too long. "There's something else, something I've been afraid to tell you because I wasn't sure how you'd handle it, and because I wasn't sure I could handle telling it." He paused, looking out over the gardens where other elderly residents were taking their afternoon walks, living their own quiet lives filled with their own hidden histories. "Anna didn't die in childbirth." The words hit me like a physical blow that left me gasping for air and grasping for something solid to hold on to. Wilhelm's voice was gentle but relentless as he continued. "She survived, but she was told that her baby had died, and she was so devastated that she agreed to let Elizabeth raise you while she recovered. The plan was always that she would reclaim her identity and her child once she was strong enough. But then," his voice trailed off, and I felt the world spinning around me in ways that made me dizzy and nauseous. "But then what, Wilhelm?" I whispered, though part of me was terrified to hear the answer. "Then she discovered that federal agents were closing in on our entire network. She realized that coming back to claim you would put you in danger, and that Elizabeth was giving you a safer, more stable life than she could ever provide. So she made the hardest decision any mother could make. She let Elizabeth keep you, and she disappeared to draw attention away from our family. Anna spent the rest of her life working for civil rights causes under different names, always moving, always fighting, but never allowing herself to come home because she was afraid her presence would endanger you. The envelope contained letters that Anna had written to me throughout my childhood and teenage years. Letters she had never sent because she believed that maintaining her distance was the best way to keep me safe. Each letter was dated and carefully preserved, documenting a mother's love from afar as she watched me grow up through reports from Elizabeth and photographs that were secretly shared through intermediaries. "My dearest Rosa," one letter began. "Today you turned 10 years old, and Elizabeth sent me a photograph of your birthday party. You look so happy, so surrounded by love, that I know I made the right choice in staying away. But I want you to know that I think about you every day, that I wonder what you're learning in school and what books you're reading, and whether you still love horses the way you did when you were small." Reading those letters, I realized that Anna had been present in my life in ways I'd never understood. An invisible guardian angel who had loved me from a distance while fighting battles that would eventually change the world. The final revelation came in the form of a hand-drawn map tucked into one of Anna's unsent letters, a map of our old family property showing the location of what she called the truth that will set you free. Wilhelm and I drove back to São Borja together, two old people on a treasure hunt that felt both ridiculous and sacred, following clues left by a woman who had spent her entire life trying to protect the people she loved while fighting for the principles she believed in. The map led us to a spot in the backyard of my childhood home, beneath the ancient fig tree where Elizabeth had hung a tire swing for me when I was 7 years old. Using shovels borrowed from Mrs. Zimmerman, we dug until we hit something hard. A metal box wrapped in oilcloth, buried 4 feet down in the rich gaucho soil that had nourished generations of immigrants trying to build new lives in a new land. Inside the box were documents that revealed the full scope of Anna's life after she'd given me up. A life that was far more extraordinary than anything I could have imagined. She had become a key figure in the early civil rights movement, working under the name Ruth Washington to help organize voter registration drives in the South. She had been arrested 16 times for civil disobedience, had helped organize the Montgomery bus boycott, and had worked closely with leaders whose names I recognized from history books. The documents included photographs of Anna at protest marches, copies of speeches she'd given, and testimonials from people whose lives she'd touched. But most importantly, there was a letter addressed to me, written in 1995, just 2 years before Anna's death from cancer. "My dearest Rosa," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've finally learned the truth about our family, and I hope you can understand why we made the choices we did. Elizabeth and I were never trying to deceive you out of cruelty or selfishness. We were trying to give you the gift of a normal childhood, free from the dangers and complications that came with being my daughter. But I want you to know that not a day passed that I didn't think about you, didn't wonder if you were happy and healthy and surrounded by love. Elizabeth sent me photographs sometimes, through intermediaries, and I kept every single one. You grew up to be exactly the kind of woman I'd hoped you'd become. Curious, determined, loyal to the people you love. Those are qualities that will serve you well as you decide what to do with the knowledge you've gained." The letter went on to explain that Anna had arranged for me to inherit certain things upon her death, including a significant amount of money that she'd saved throughout her life, money that was being held in trust until I could prove my identity. But more than that, she'd left me something intangible. The knowledge that I came from a line of women who had never backed down from a fight they believed in. You have your mother's courage and your aunt's wisdom, the letter concluded. Use them both to build a life that honors the sacrifices we made. But don't let our choices limit your own. The truth can be a burden, but it can also be a liberation. Choose freedom, my darling girl. Choose to live boldly and love deeply, and know that everything Elizabeth and I did was because we loved you more than life itself. As I sat in that backyard holding Anna's final letter, with Wilhelm beside me, and the evidence of a lifetime of secrets spread out on the ground between us, I realized that my journey of discovery was complete, but my real life was just beginning. For 75 years I had lived as Rosa Muller, the quiet daughter of a quiet woman in a quiet border town. Now I understood that I was actually Rosa Schmidt, daughter of one of the most courageous civil rights activists of her generation, raised by a woman who had sacrificed her own identity to keep me safe. The weight of this legacy was overwhelming, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to wonder why I'd always felt restless in São Borja, why I'd always been drawn to stories of people who fought for justice, why I'd never been content to simply accept the world as it was presented to me. These traits weren't character flaws or signs of discontent. They were my inheritance from a mother who had changed history and an aunt who had changed her life to protect me. Wilhelm and I spent the following months establishing a relationship that neither of us had ever expected to have. He moved to São Borja, into a small apartment near my house, and we began the slow process of becoming a family. We visited Anna's grave in the Porto Alegre cemetery, where she was buried under the name Ruth Washington, and Wilhelm finally had the chance to say goodbye to the woman he'd loved for 70 years. Together, we established a small scholarship fund for young activists, using part of the money Anna had left me. But perhaps most importantly, I began to understand that the story of our family wasn't a tragedy of secrets and lies, but a testament to the power of love to transcend conventional boundaries. Elizabeth had loved me enough to give up her own identity. Anna had loved me enough to give up her child. Wilhelm had loved us both enough to spend a lifetime searching for what he'd lost. The German rose garden that Elizabeth had tended so carefully throughout my childhood suddenly made perfect sense. Each variety represented a different aspect of our family's story. The white roses for the purity of Elizabeth's sacrifice, the red ones for the passion of Anna's convictions, the yellow ones for the hope that had sustained Wilhelm through decades of separation. And in the center of the garden, the pink roses that bloomed every spring without fail, representing the love that had held our family together, even when we were scattered across time and distance and mistaken identities. My story doesn't end with discovery. It ends with understanding, and with the knowledge that truth, no matter how complicated, is always preferable to even the most well-intentioned lie. Thank you so much for staying with me until the end. I hope my story has touched your heart the way sharing it has touched mine. If you enjoyed learning about my family's incredible journey of love, sacrifice, and ultimate truth, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. It helps us so much. Every day we bring you new, emotional stories about life, family, and the incredible strength of the human spirit. So feel free to explore and find your favorites. And of course, I'd love to hear from you. What did you think of my story? Have you ever discovered family secrets that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Tell us in the comments. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story that will remind you that truth, no matter how long it takes to surface, always finds a way to shine through.